everyone. Thank you for joining us. There are 130 of you who have signed up for this webinar. You're from civil society organisations, funds and foundations, academia, the public sector, support structures, and you are workers in the sector, volunteers, concerned citizens. And we now have 1.5 hours ahead of us to discuss the relationship between civil society and private giving. My name is Floriant Covelli, and I'm Managing Director of the IFMA, French Institute for Civil Society Organisations, that is. And so to start, I'm going to give the floor to our partner, Benjamin Kurc from the Franco-German Citizens Fund, without whom we wouldn't have been able to organise this webinar. So, Benjamin, over to you. Hello, everyone. Hello in German. I'm going to speak French, and you have simultaneous interpretation available. So first I'd like to welcome you to this webinar on behalf of the Franco-German Citizens Fund. We are not a public or private foundation. We are a Franco-German international organisation which emerged from a cooperation treaty signed by France and Germany in 2019. We're supported by the French and German states, and our role is to support Franco-German initiatives in order to build links between civil society in the two countries. And we support projects on many different themes, such as those linked to democratic issues, philanthropy, culture, environmental issues, etc. We mainly work with public and private partners, and most of these are CSOs working in France and Germany. We also work with the local authorities, and for these partners the real aim is to develop projects which are run jointly by France and Germany. We therefore finance projects, but we have also identified that in civil society in France and Germany there's a real need for support. And therefore we try to, in order to implement actions which are often in the public interest. And there's a shared challenge, which is the need to obtain funding, whether that be public or private. The institutional and philanthropic landscape in France and Germany is relatively different between the two countries. In France, the public authorities are quite powerful and they fund a few major overarching issues via calls for projects, for example. But on the other hand, in Germany, although the public authorities are present and important, there's also a whole host of private actors, including foundations and other entities. And these are much more significant and powerful than in France. Something we can also observe is in this Franco-German dialogue, there's a need to respond to these shared challenges. So we quickly arrived at the conclusion that we need to get civil society actors talking to each other, as well as philanthropic actors, those which are involved on the scene in France and Germany, whether they have a national or an international scope. And we saw that we needed to link these parties up because it's in both of their interests to create these alliances in order to respond together to these challenges. At the Citizens Fund, what we've identified is a bit of an imbalance between French and German actors, whether that be at structural level in philanthropy or among those working on the ground who need support and funding in order to be able to do their work. So in the light of this webinar is even more necessary and important. We're really pleased to be involved in this initiative from the Maecenata Foundation and the French Institute for Civil Society Organisations to begin shedding a bit of light on these challenges from a Franco-German perspective. The solutions emerging from this will be applicable to other contexts too, and so we need to see this Franco-German context as a sort of laboratory, as it were. And at the Citizens Fund, we're very interested and we're very curious about this Franco-German approach. And it could perhaps be extended to supporting actors involved in philanthropy in France and Germany too. Because we can see that there's a need to work together between private and public philanthropic actors. And we're very keen to help out and to be able to build bridges and help resolve this equation. And so on that note, I'd like to wish you a fruitful discussion, and I will hand the floor back to Floriant. Thank you very much, Benjamin, for your introduction and for your support. I'm going to be hosting this webinar, and I have the pleasure of welcoming 3 experts who are going to talk about our subject today. Inga Wachsmann is Head of Programme at Porticus Foundation in France, and she will give us a point of view of somebody working on the ground in terms of the relationship between philanthropy and CSOs. She will give us a French and European perspective based on her role at Porticus and her broad experience of philanthropy in Europe, with a particular focus on democratic issues and trust-based philanthropy. Dr. Kathrin Dombrowski is Director of Coordination at the ECFI Network, the European Community Foundation Initiative, and she will provide a European and German point of view based on a fundamental aspect of the relationship, which is the local aspect. And she will tell us what community foundations are all about and what they do. Then we have Dr. Rupert Graf Strachwitz, who is Senior Strategic Advisor at the Maecenata Foundation in Berlin. He is a specialist in civil society, philanthropy and public policy, and he will provide an analysis from a German and European point of view. And I'd like to thank Maecenata, which has co-organised this webinar with us. We'll have 2 sessions for discussion with all of the participants in this webinar. And I'd like to ask you to ask your questions as we go along in writing in the chat. And you can do that by clicking on the button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, the question and answer button. We're very keen to hear from you, hear your questions, your reactions, and any resources that you might like to share with us. But first of all, I'd like to say a few words on the structure of the French Institute for Civil Society Organisations and our work, just to introduce and set a backdrop for our discussions. The founding conviction of the Institute is simple but strong. There's a major challenge and even a democratic imperative to get to know civil society better, first for the CSOs themselves and for their public and private partners. And it's also important for society as a whole in order to provide better information for decision makers and citizens on what CSOs specifically provide for society and democracy. And to address this challenge, we designed the Institute as a research and development platform serving the civil society sector with thematic programmes that always go through 4 major stages. Firstly, we take into account the needs of actors, what are the issues that are at play on the ground concerning the CSOs and their partners, what issues need to be researched to have a real impact on practices. And then the second stage is to mobilise researchers and people working on the ground to produce knowledge and then be able to disseminate this knowledge so it can feed into strategies and be translated into new practices. So why are we investigating this subject of the relationship between philanthropy and civil society? Well, that's because we've identified that there's a bit of a blind spot in terms of this subject in France. Research into philanthropy is quite well developed, but there's often no real link to the world of civil society. And then on the other hand, there's a lot of research into civil society, but it doesn't really relate to private giving. So we've tried to identify what's missing in terms of knowledge and research to see how we can organise this relationship between private giving and CSOs. Our work took the form of a working group, a French working group, which met between 2023 and 2024 with 51 participants from CSOs, foundations, federations, support structures and public authorities. And this work produced 5 main areas of research, which I will present to you now and which will underpin our discussions today in this webinar. The first area had to do with concepts of dependency and interdependency, which comes from this relationship between private giving and civil society. During the group discussions, we identified asymmetries in the donor to beneficiary relationship and even influence that donors could have on the economic models of CSOs. There was a call for more horizontal and more partnership-based relationships. And then how can we move from this towards trust-based philanthropy? And how can philanthropic actors move towards non-financial means of support? And that raises the question of the triangular relationship between private giving, CSOs and the public authorities, against the backdrop of the role of donations as a lever for independence in France and in Europe as a whole. And in these times of budgetary crisis, it's an important issue. A second point is the role of private giving in the socio-economic structures of CSOs. And when we talk about socio-economic structures, we're not just talking about financial resources. We're also talking about the general balance between all resources used by CSOs. So of course, that does include diversified sources of funds, but also volunteer commitments and partnerships and alliances. In France, there's quite a lot of information on the financial amounts that come from private giving. However, the way philanthropy can support socioeconomic models above and beyond the economic models themselves is a subject that there's not very much information on. So what are the motivations of philanthropic actors in getting involved in this type of relationship? And these have not been analysed beyond an economic standpoint. With regard to civil society, calling on private giving is something that's sometimes a clear strategy, sometimes it's just opportunism, sometimes it represents a limitation, and there's sometimes even cultural resistance. So how can we switch between these categories? We don't really know that yet. As concerns philanthropy, there are also questions about the role that they can play in supporting socio-economic models, and there's often a tendency for these budgets to be presented as budgets for R&D and innovation in the CSO sector, but that's not yet been scientifically proven. So that was the second area. Now, a third area had to do with evaluation, which is at the heart of the relationship between private giving and CSOs, and which is perceived both as an opportunity and a limitation. It's an opportunity when it becomes a space for dialogue, for co-creation, for mutual learning, but it's a limitation when it becomes a tool for control or for influence in an asymmetric relationship. With regard to this issue of evaluation, the group firstly pointed out that there's a lack of a real space to analyse the societal value that private giving and CSOs create together, when actually this societal value is at the core of their reason for being and their reason for working together. A fourth area had to do with the joint contribution to democracy made by CSOs and private giving. Taking a broad view of democracy, to which CSOs and foundations contribute, daily democracy, the power to act, social links, deliberation, detection of weak signals, these are all issues that come into play. And in a context of democratic crisis, and also a crisis of trust, we wondered about what civil society and private giving produce together from a trust-based point of view. CSOs are often seen as institutions to be trusted, as indicated by surveys. Giving with trust is the slogan of the French organisation that labels CSOs that collect donations. And then can foundations be seen as trusted third parties? So the question is, if the relationship with private giving can strengthen the intermediary role played by institutions, and if it can be an institutional lever for trust in the light of the democratic crisis. And on the subject of democratic issues, we also thought about the potentially nefarious effects on democracy that could stem from this relationship. For example, forms of prioritising certain causes in private giving and then abandoning other causes which it might be less attractive to donors or foundations. And we also talked about counter-progressive philanthropy, which could be linked to extreme right-wing movements. And then a last area had to do with the local aspect. We wondered how do local cultural and political contexts come into play in the relationship between private giving and CSOs, and why might CSOs be more inclined to call on private giving in certain regions. We also wondered what the different forms of relating to the local context are for philanthropy. We know that there's the community foundations model. Are there other types of models, and if so, what form do they take? We also wondered if the local aspect changed the causes in some way that are supported, and if it meant that there's more support for certain initiatives which might not be supported as much at national level. So that's a quick overview of the results of our work. You can find more detail on these in the white paper that we published and which is available on our website, and we have put a link in the chat in French and English because unfortunately it hasn't been translated into German yet, but we know that German speakers are very, very good at English. So that was the first part. This work produced in France. Well, we wanted to get a European perspective on it, and that's why we're hosting this webinar, to open up this Franco-German debate, to compare the different philanthropic and CSO models in Europe. So to take a different view of the relationship between philanthropy, civil society and the public powers and democracy, and also to see if we can draw some lessons from this at European level. And so we're going to go around all our speakers, firstly so that they can tell us what the major issues are from their point of view that structure the relationship between philanthropy and civil society. So we'll firstly hear from Rupert Strachwitz. Rupert, what are the main issues involved, from your point of view as a long-term analyst, in the relationship between philanthropy, civil society and public policy in Germany and Europe? Thank you very much, Floriant. Hello, everyone. Many thanks to our French colleagues who have put together and organised this webinar. For us in the world of foundations and civil society, it's very important to have this sort of webinar, and it also has political importance. We are very much aware that Europeans need to come together and create stronger links. That's not only the case between states, but also in civil society. And therefore, this webinar is a vital tool to be able to go down that path. I'm a researcher and an observer of the landscape. And following Florian's introduction, I would like to mention two things. When we look at it from an internal perspective, when we look at the relationship between different actors in civil society and with foundations and philanthropy, and of course the CSOs themselves, we need to redefine this relationship. And as I see it, that goes for the whole of Europe. For 30 years, large foundations, philanthropy, and also companies have been prioritising, and the companies are acting the same way as the state, so they've been prioritising funding for individual projects. So that is to say that they are acting in exactly the same way as private philanthropists who donate, say, €10 and who expect it to immediately be transformed into milk for a newborn somewhere in Africa, for example. But of course, that's simply not how it works. But this only becomes clear when we explain this to people, when we explain to them what actually happens to their donation. When we reach out to companies and foundations, well, foundations need financial resources to be able to expand, and that might be a specific objective that they have. But they shouldn't just restrict themselves to funding projects over 1 year or 2 years. We've seen that they often do this, and in fact Germany is littered with projects that have been started and have received funding over 1 or 2 years, and then when the funding dries up, the organisation is no longer capable of maintaining these projects. And so these projects cannot survive over the long term. So we need a relationship based on partnership between philanthropists and beneficiaries. Between the grant makers and the guarantees, as it were. That is to say that all actors, all organisations need to be able to continue to exist over the long term, and therefore they need a lot of support. Civil society needs to develop further and it needs help. And something I'd like to mention that was very influential in Germany in 2025 is that political forces had strongly objected to the state financing civil society activities. And these attacks are, of course, not directed against small, well-behaved organisations, but primarily against those which have a public profile and criticise the state. And this especially comes from right-wing groups. A lot of action has been taken to prevent this. So it's mainly the right wing, but embarrassingly, however, the same can be said of the left wing. And this has led to a major discussion about where civil society organisations should actually get their funding from. The consequence of all of this was a huge show of solidarity in civil society when it all started back in February, when there were major attacks against organisations like ATTAC and Campact, and the Federal Association of German Foundations very forcefully stood up for these organisations and defended them. That would have been almost unthinkable 10 years ago. So things have definitely changed, and we need more of that. But we also need to consider where state funding is appropriate and where it might not be. Any organisation taking a public stance, and this is very important for civil society in order to critically examine political processes and state mechanisms, so anyone taking a stance should not receive their funding from the same sources that they're criticising. It's therefore understandable that it's easier for there to be private donors for these purposes. On the other hand, there are many organisations that, due to their activities, depend on government funding. However, there are two things to consider here. Many organisations in Germany provide services for which they receive payment from the state. However, this is not what's meant by support. Support in terms of subsidisation means that the activities in themselves of an organisation are funded. So we need a new relationship between public institutions and private philanthropy. That also means that organisations, whether it be foundations or the funding departments of companies and so on, as well as civil society organisations, need to rethink their financing structure, as well as their partners and their allies. But it doesn't necessarily have to lead to a complete separation. Heated words have certainly been exchanged between civil society and the state, saying that if the state doesn't support us, well, then we're no longer going to support the state either. And philanthropic actors contest some of these ideas because philanthropy does strongly support a lot of public institutions, like schools, universities, social bodies, etc. So we could make the argument that it all needs to be completely separated out, but then the state would end up with an even bigger problem ultimately. So it's better to aim for good, productive cooperation. But for that to happen, everyone needs to play their part and everyone needs to reorganise themselves a bit. And so that's all from me for my first contribution. Thank you. Thank you, Rupert. Now I'd like us to hear from Inga Wachsmann. Inga, what can you tell us about the relationship between civil society and private giving based on your daily work in the field of philanthropy from a French and European angle? Thank you very much. I'll try and speak slowly. I think if I was going to speak German, I would probably be speaking more slowly, but I'll try to speak at a reasonable speed for the interpreters. Thank you very much for inviting me to be here today, and it's really nice to see Kathrin and Rupert as well here. I'd like to pick up on your first point, Rupert, about relationships, and talk about relationships in more of an ideal framework, what I would like to see happen in philanthropy in any case. So I'm going to speak from a standpoint of the relationship that I would like to see, and not necessarily the type of relationship you described, Rupert, which is more of a short-term relationship, support for individual projects, etc. I'm going to base what I'm saying more on relationships with philanthropy that aim to change the system and create a real relationship, because we've understood that that is how we can get real added value. So I'm going to talk about philanthropy, which aims to contribute to ensuring that the people concerned are present in the decision-making process, and that philanthropy is run in a more participatory way. And I can give you a few examples of this later on if you're interested. So this participatory philanthropy is what it's all about. And another point is that it's a type of philanthropy based on a relationship of trust. There are a lot more references to this in English than there are in French, to trust-based philanthropy. So to break things down into two parts, firstly I'd like to say that good practices, best practices do exist, and more of these are coming to light. It's still a fairly recent idea, and of course there needs to be further change and development, but there are best practices in existence. So I'll describe what I understand when I say best practices. I mean a relationship that is built over time. Sometimes it does start off as an individual project, but then it moves on to more structural support, and a lot of work is done together to then try and put in place a partnership. Sometimes activities can be co-created together. That's an example. And it provides better knowledge, better mutual knowledge, and it means that shared objectives can be put in place rather than just temporary support for something fairly precise. It's a real relationship that is built. And then once the relationship has been built, it has an impact on evaluation. And I'm picking up on that because that has to do with what you mentioned as well, Floriant. In terms of evaluation, we can move away from evaluation in the strictest sense towards a sort of learning process. When a project is implemented, sometimes very concrete results are expected in terms of figures, etc. But we also need to take a step back and look at the structure of the relationship and how far this has progressed. And we also need to consider the effect that is generated within society. And also to take a look at the partnership in itself. So the state of the partnership itself can be included in the evaluation. It's one of the results, in fact, to improve this relationship. Let me check I'm not forgetting anything. Yes, so examining the partnership itself is something important, and I think that's about it for my first contribution, and I'll be happy to talk further about the process of democratisation and inclusion in society in general. And then what we end up with is a relationship which can raise questions about activities and also the way philanthropy works with the civil society sector and vice versa. Civil society can give its opinion to the philanthropic sector as well. A lot of CSOs have to carry out these evaluations with a lot of limitations, depending on the type of funding, the context of the funding. There are reporting obligations. There are also financial limitations, that this issue of dependencies that you touched upon. And so if we want to stop this type of evaluation, we need to replace it with something else. But what? Could it be interviews, meetings, visits, regular monitoring of the partnership, co-creation, and building a real partnership rather than just a relationship based on funding? Meetings between teams as well, training. It's not yet very clear, there's not a real structure in place yet that could take over from the evaluation system. That is traditional evaluation based on indicators, etc. So there's a bit of a question mark over it. And as I already mentioned, it's really important to build this relationship as a direct contribution to democracy. So, coming back to the challenges in the current context, and we've already talked about this, there's a reduction in funding available. A lot of donors are disappearing or reducing the amount of funding they have available or redirecting their funding. And sometimes that has to do with the principle of discrimination, defamation, etc. And sometimes the funding is just naturally redirected due to the context or for other reasons. That can happen too. But what's certain is that there are more and more civil society actors that are calling on philanthropy, actors that have identified philanthropy as a potential source of support. So on the one hand, the needs need to be analysed. We need to be aware of where the needs lie. And on the other hand, there's the reality of philanthropy, which is that budgets are limited. There's often no funding available for long-term funding. So all that is available is funding for short-term projects, as we said. And there's also a need for new legal skills and new general skills as well, in terms of providing support, reaching out and meeting with the actors that are making requests. I'll finish what I'm saying very soon. I think I might be running out of time, but I've just got a couple more points. So we need new skills, more strategic skills, so that we can anticipate and plan. And there are a lot of limits too, a lot of limitations. And therefore we need skills to not necessarily get around these, but to cope with these. And there's also been a change to philanthropy, in which it's not always about, well, we want to support projects, but there are fewer and fewer employees. Sometimes it goes in waves. We recruit people and then we end up with smaller teams once again. And Benjamin, you said that there's a need for support, but support requires human resources. We need people to do this. And obviously a relationship has to be built up over time. And with fewer and fewer resources, it simply doesn't work. And the last thing I wanted to say is that we might have the beginnings of a solution in the form of creating spaces for learning, for people to meet each other and get to know each other, to reduce mistrust, etc. We might not really know how to do this yet, but what's for sure is when things are done collectively, when relationships are built up one by one between foundations and partners in a bilateral way, if this is done properly, it can have a bit of a snowball effect. It can be shared and disseminated, this relationship of trust. And so creating these spaces can provide some real security, a sort of safe space for the different entities to meet up and do things together. So I think it's about organising ourselves and seeing that we're all in the same boat. And I think that could be a way towards a solution. But now I will hand the floor over to Kathrin, because I'm sure she has a lot of things to say as well. Now, Kathrin, a question for you. How do you see these issues from a European and German perspective, based on your work with community foundations? Hello. Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here today and to present the concept of community foundations. We work at European level in my organisation, the European Community Foundation Initiative, which means that we generally use the term community foundations. Another term that is now gaining traction in German-speaking countries is Gemeinschaftsstiftung, which means collective foundations. So what do these foundations have in common? Well, they are locally focused. We can talk about place-based philanthropy, or some use the term local philanthropy. These are foundations that are independent and participatory, and they are truly founded and run by citizens for citizens. They're a mix between citizen involvement, creation of funds, as well as democratic elements. Now for a bit of history. The first community foundation was created 110 years ago in Cleveland, Ohio, and then one was created in the UK 50 years ago. It's called the Wiltshire Community Foundation, and it just celebrated its 50th anniversary in 2025 actually. And then in Germany 2 foundations were established simultaneously in 1996 in Gütersloh and Hanover. There are currently almost 800 community foundations in Europe. 400 of these are based in Germany, in fact around 435. So that means that Germany is very dominant in Europe in terms of the number of community foundations. However, we need to bear in mind that these are generally small foundations run by volunteers that are active in both grant-making and operational activities. To put things in perspective, if we compare it with the UK actually has the biggest community foundation sector in Europe in terms of financial resources. There are only 50 community foundations in the UK, but these typically cover a bigger geographical area and have access to much more funding. So what is a community foundation? As I've already said, it's a foundation run by citizens for citizens. The term community foundation is not legally protected in Germany, and there are a lot of foundations that call themselves community foundations. That's sort of their packaging, but the content doesn't really correspond. So to address this challenge, German community foundations began thinking very early on in their development about what the essential characteristics of a community foundation are, and they developed a list of 10 characteristics. These now serve as the basis for a seal of approval or a form of certification in Germany, which is currently held by over 200 community foundations. So what are these characteristics? Well, I'll focus here on those that pertain specifically to community foundations because many of them also apply to the non-profit law sector in general. Of course, firstly they have to be non-profit, which they have in common with other non-profit organisations. But what distinguishes a community foundation is that they often bring together many donors who each contribute small sums. And this means that community foundations represent a model of democratic, low-threshold philanthropy. Another criterion is that they have to be independent, that is politically and religiously, and that's a prerequisite under German non-profit law. But what's also important in community foundations is that there mustn't be any kind of dominance of any particular party, for example, a founding family, a sole founder, or a company. The scope of their work is very much at the local level. Their work always covers a certain geographical area, whether that be a city, a district, or a region, and that's the context that they operate in. However, within this local environment, they work on any number of different themes, and that's also an important distinguishing feature from other foundations. In Germany, there's a catalogue of different charitable causes, and community foundations cover a relatively broad range of these. They operate in the areas of education, culture, intergenerational cooperation, the environment, etc. And the reason for this is that all of these areas interact with each other at the local level. So we can say that a foundation, for example, that exclusively works on environmental issues, wouldn't be a community foundation, according to this definition. Unlike other local civil society organisations, community foundations aim to build up assets. So that means that they build up their capital to form basic assets, and citizens can make additional contributions at any time. German community foundations are generally dedicated to promoting community engagement, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Other criteria are transparency, building local networks, and involvement and participation of the public, of course, which is very important. This means that in community foundations, there are committees, just like in any other foundation. The difference is that, in this case, there are citizens sitting as members of the committee. Once again, we can see this idea that they are independent, inclusive, and offer opportunities for local people to get involved. What really stands out in German community foundations, more so than in other European countries, is this Foundation Plus model. What that means is that they combine elements of foundations such as asset accumulation, long-term focus and support, but on the other hand, they also incorporate elements of civil society because they essentially create the infrastructure and means to enable voluntary work and participation of citizens. And that applies both to the committees and the projects they implement. Now for a few facts and figures about the situation of community foundations in Germany, taken from the current report of the Foundation for Active Citizenship, which carries out a survey of German community foundations every few years. As I mentioned, there are around 435 community foundations in Germany, in which approximately 400,000 people are involved. So if my calculations are right, that means that there are 900 to 1,000 people involved in each community foundation, which is a lot. Since the 1990s, they have mobilised €1 billion for the common good, of which 684 million is foundation capital, and approximately 265 million is donations and other funds. They manage over 1,000 funds and trust funds. So now you've got all the facts and figures, and I can see that I've reached my time limit. So to wrap up, let me just say that community foundations are independent, participatory, and they are long-term infrastructure which operate in the local communities. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much, Kathrin. We have a question now from Emanuel Herrenschneider, and I think that's for you, Inga. She says, "Hello, I'd be interested to hear some examples of participatory philanthropy." Kathrin, perhaps you might also have some examples to provide on this subject. How, via community foundations, can we bring about participatory philanthropy? Inga, would you like to start? Yes, thank you. I'll try and keep it brief. So in terms of examples, there are examples. They might be few and far between, but they do exist. There are, of course, these community foundations. But in participatory philanthropy, there are different levels that need to be distinguished. Sometimes foundations think that just because they've asked their partner a question, that constitutes participation. It can have to do with how the funds are distributed, and there can be a shared decision-making process or a participatory decision-making process. There's one in France that's just been created called the Fund for Democracy, where people can get involved in how the funds are redistributed. And at European level, what's called Fund Action has been in existence for quite a while now. It's all one word, Fund Action. So there are quite a lot of funds and foundations that are trying to bring in these mechanisms, but it's still quite rare. And then for us, for example, we can get people involved, get people participating when we create our programs, because our foundation creates its own programs. So we might ask a coordinator or a partner or even a panel of people who have been selected more or less randomly. Well, it's not an actual citizens' assembly, but we try and get people involved in this deliberative democracy type procedure. So, of course, these procedures can be applied to philanthropy in terms of how decisions are taken about where money is going to be directed to, how philanthropy is created. It can also be a question of consulting people. We can have advisory boards where the employees can get involved, or the people concerned, the beneficiaries of the foundation, can also get involved. And this can also happen at the evaluation stage. I don't know if that fully answers the question. I can give you some other examples if you think that's useful. Thank you very much, Inga. Yes, thank you for those initial examples. Now, perhaps we can hand over to Kathrin to give us a few German examples. Yes, of course. As Inga said, here we have these advisory boards, and we even have young people's advisory boards, because young people's participation is a very important topic for us, which we're keen to promote. They, of course, have their role to play, and it's very important that this participation is not just symbolic, but that it has a real tangible impact. In other European countries, or in other countries, there's a very exciting example, which is Foundation Scotland, which developed the Regenerative Futures Fund in Edinburgh, and it's implementing this side by side with local civil society organisations, and it's also providing long-term support there. Thank you very much, Kathrin. We've just had another question come in from Elise Renaudin. For Kathrin, once again, she says, could you provide some real-life examples from community foundations in Germany? Actually, you might just have answered that question, I think. I've only just read the question. Yes, I think actually you've already pretty much answered this question, Kathrin. So now I'd like to propose that we move on to the second part of this webinar. And to move the debate forward a little bit, I'd like to ask our panellists 3 questions. So a first question for Inga and Kathrin. So Inga, you started talking about this point earlier, but how can we strengthen real trust-based relations between private funders and civil society organisations with involvement over a longer time period and taking a more strategic approach? Inga, would you like to start? Yes, of course. Well, it goes without saying, but it has to do with longer term funding, which provides more visibility and can perhaps be a bit more flexible than money that's very much earmarked. But of course that seems like a very simple answer. But it's important to state it anyway. That is a precondition. It has to do with professionalisation of both parties as well, because when we're dealing with volunteers, can you hear me, says Inga? Yes, we can hear you. Okay. So professionalisation, that's a real key part of philanthropy, and on the civil society side too. Volunteers can be trained, relationships can be forged, and that has to do with training, and also training in terminology and making sure that everybody's using the same words and that terminology corresponds. I've already said something about long-term support. It's also important to take a step back and look at the relationship, analyse it and improve it, and define criteria to do this. I've already talked about evaluation, which can move more towards the learning process, but what do we actually mean by that? And what can we then do with what we learn? But I won't go over that again. I've also mentioned creating trust on both sides, and I think in philanthropy it's quite a recent notion to cooperate and coordinate with partners. It's great and we need to do more of this, but it is fairly recent. So there's competition not only in terms of financial actors, but also in terms of donors on the side of philanthropy. Coordination, cooperation, getting to know each other better, that can make a real contribution to this relationship. And then the issue of dependency, well, that is a real challenge. Because I think that actually we do need to be able to support an actor 100% over the long term, because there might not be any other funding available, but it doesn't necessarily create dependency. But then, of course, it can do as well. There can be dependence created by this partnership-type relationship. So I just wanted to raise that because the issue of dependence is important. I'll stop there. Thank you very much, Inga. I'll give you the floor back on the second question. Kathrin, at local level, how can trust be built, specifically over time, moving beyond classic relationships between financial backers and organisations? And that might tie into a question that Marianne Longley asked. She asked, with regard to community foundations, I would like to understand how citizens get involved in a way that represents the whole of society. Are names pulled out of a hat? Are there any criteria? So I've added an extra question on for you, so you'll have an extra minute to respond. Thank you very much. I absolutely agree with everything Inga said. In terms of philanthropic action, but I'd like to add something too. When we think about philanthropy as a whole, based on assets, etc., community foundations can't really compete in this league. But what's very important is trust. And trust is considered the main asset, really, for community foundations. And it's a bit of a shame that we can't measure trust. That is to say, the added value created by trust. And the added value of community foundations is systematically underrepresented in research on philanthropy. It's an intangible value. So, of course, we can't measure trust, and it needs to be reciprocal. It needs to be part of dialogue with civil society. Community foundations do offer this long-term commitment, and they take into account the needs of citizens living in the local area. The third point has to do with trust as well, and Rupert mentioned this, and that is that it's easy to lose trust. And we're living in times where there's less and less trust in democracy and in organisations. And that means that community foundations have to be quite careful about how they position themselves and what sort of relationships they enter into. In many European countries, community foundations are actually refusing to cooperate with the state because it's become damaging to their reputation. So there isn't this relationship of cooperation with the state, because there's a loss of confidence in the public institutions. Thank you, Kathrin. I now have a second question for all three of you. What role can philanthropy play in the defence and revitalisation of democracy? Inga, would you like to start off? Yes, well, I might be talking from more of a personal angle here. A few points are that there are fewer resources, space for civil society is shrinking, and what can we do about that? What can we do about that together? First of all, we need to ensure we can continue doing our work. That's first and foremost. not even venturing onto the subject of defence yet, just being able to continue the work done by civil society, that's very important. And building this relationship together and doing that more and more. So just continue to do what we do. And if we can already do that, then that's very good. That's the first point. And then with regard to philanthropy, things need to be flexible. We saw this with the COVID crisis, with Ukraine, and with more local crises that have emerged as well. Floods, for example. We've seen that providing flexibility helps create spaces that can really help and strengthen civil society. Philanthropy needs to show that they're working alongside civil society as well, because civil society plays this role of being a counterpower and being quite critical, so this needs to be stated clearly and explained. And I might be repeating myself, but we need to organise ourselves in the world of philanthropy and organise ourselves along with our partners. We've talked about community foundations, but there's also community organising. So we can take inspiration from good organisational practices in our respective spheres and see how we can put this into practice. And there are many other things that we could do as well, but I'll stop there for the moment. Thank you, Inga. Kathrin, on these third spaces, these spaces for dialogue represented by community foundations, is that a local response to polarisation? Is it a way of responding to the democratic crisis, perhaps? Yes, that's one response, and it's very important. Of course, democracy is a very important subject for our work. And community foundations are really affected by these tensions, as Rupert mentioned, by the social context, etc. And in Germany, the social context is very polarised, and it's getting more and more so. If we go to the east of Germany, where there are community foundations operating too, it's a territory that's very much pervaded by the AfD, the extreme right. And so in the east of Germany, the AfD has a real stronghold. And that has an impact on public space. It's dominated by this right-wing party. And that's very difficult to contend with for community foundations. How can we continue to support dialogue formats? How can we create spaces for these dialogues? And how can we get different groups sitting around the same table to discuss things? There need to be spaces where people can meet up and discuss things outside political spaces and outside the social class they belong to. But that's complicated because there's a lack of budget in the local authorities that can be used for that kind of thing. But community foundations are very active in trying to fight against disinformation. They organise training sessions, media literacy sessions. To conclude, I think it's not easy for community foundations because on the one hand they do have to take up a certain position, they do have to defend values, human dignity, fundamental rights, etc. But on the other hand, we can't forget that they are operating in their local contexts where these values are being challenged. And that's quite difficult to get to grips with and find a solution to. These are complex issues. Floriant seems to have been disconnected. I don't know if you can hear me. Yes, I can hear you. Perhaps we can hand over to Rupert now. Yes, I'd just like to jump in here and make a couple of comments. On the one hand, foundations, private philanthropists and companies are called upon to improve the resilience of our democracy, to defend it, to develop it. As we all know, our democracy and our open society is in danger. We're seeing a backsliding of democracy across the board, and private funders need to be involved in addressing this. Currently, only a very few large organisations in Germany are doing this, however. There's the Bertelsmann Foundation, the Maecenata Foundation, and a few others, the Robert Bosch Foundation, for example. But much more could be done. However, the legal situation is somewhat unclear on this. And for many organisations, it's difficult to get involved in this field, so something needs to be done about that as well. My second point is on a completely different matter. I would say that foundations, above all, need to be brave. They need to find different ways of providing funding, and that applies to private philanthropists too. They need to provide support in a different format from what the state does and from what large organisations do. And that's where a bit of a dilemma arises with the participatory element. There's an example of this that we can see in Germany and in Austria. Some of you might have heard of Marlene Engelhorn, who wanted to use a very participatory approach in order to use an inheritance for philanthropic purposes. But what actually transpired was in fact a very conventional funding policy, because so many compromises had to be negotiated with the many stakeholders involved in this participatory approach. And the thing is that foundations can only compete on quality and not on quantity with much larger donors. So that means that they need to be able to take a stand and say, I'm going to do something completely different. And that's why the participatory approach has its limits. I prefer to talk about a consultative element. Of course, there are foundations and companies that just make things up as they go along, and they get terrible results. All I can recommend really is that they seek advice, that they consult each other, and then make decisions, and try and do something unconventional, something totally new. Because in the end, it all boils down to the issue of democracy. It's about having an open, free society. And for that, we need all sorts of different ideas to save democracy and to ensure that we don't slide into autocracy. It was a Frenchman who first described this in the 19th century, Alexis de Tocqueville. He said that many small initiatives produce an open society, and especially those which can do so with their own resources. But they have to be brave, and above all, they have to do something different, something new that no one has done before, something that makes people say, he's crazy. But in the end, it might just turn out to be the right solution. Thank you, Rupert. And sorry I got disconnected, but I can see that you don't even need a host actually. Everything seems to have continued very well without me. So to finish, I have a final question for Kathrin and Rupert. With regard to innovating or just reproducing what's already been done, how can philanthropy change things? Rupert, as you see it, is innovation just a way of doing things, or is it a strategic choice? Well, innovation is important, but not as a value in itself. Someone who restores old violins, for example, should just stick to the task at hand and shouldn't think that he has to do something innovative by painting them all pink, for example. On the other hand, there are people who have really ventured off the beaten track and created startups, for example, or people who have become millionaires by the age of 30 and are thinking about getting involved in philanthropy. And here, the focus is naturally on innovation and new things. And we need both. We most certainly need private funding throughout Europe for our cultural heritage. After all, we want to preserve the Europe we have and not create a completely different one. And we also need private funding with completely new ideas to move the world forwards. Our democracy, in the sense of state democracy, hardly produces any new ideas anymore, which is sad, but it's a real observation. And I say this as a political scientist with great regret. And that's why we need these ideas from outside. We need ideas which come from the interplay between initiatives and their financial backers. We need a broad range of these new ideas. And to anyone who feels called upon to participate in any way, in any place, all I can say is please go ahead. Thank you, Rupert. Kathrin, hyperlocal innovation, can that be a lever for systemic change? Well, I agree with everything that Rupert said. Innovation is not necessarily better than just doing things as they always have been done. There are a lot of local projects in Europe. And the problem is often that we are unable to scale these up. If we're able to scale up good projects, as Inga mentioned earlier, there needs to be work done in the philanthropic sector in a more systemic way. We can't just wait till a problem arises to address it. We need to be preventing problems. We need to change our mindset. And that can happen at a local level, where trust is created, and trust is very important, so that people really adopt this mindset of change. I talked about social capital earlier. And on the one hand, that means that we're able to bring together different social groups and bring about change in this way. Bring together people who are very different from each other, and also engage in partnerships with local authorities, with businesses. We can bring together all of these different local actors and bring about a real long-term impact. Thank you. Thank you very much, Kathrin. We seem to have lost Inga. I think she's got a connection problem. We had a question for her, but I don't know if she can hear us. Perhaps I'll just ask the question anyway, and then Rupert and Kathrin, you might have some answers that you can provide. So the question came from Angelica Uyos. She says, how can you begin a partnership approach when trust doesn't exist yet? And I have another question too. That's for Kathrin. And it's Marianne Longley who asked this question about community foundations. She wants to understand how citizens get involved in a way that represents the whole of society. Are our names picked out of a hat? Are there certain criteria? So perhaps you can start with that question, Kathrin. Should I start with the second question? Yes, please. Okay, well, for community foundations, it's natural. It's not a citizens' assembly, of course. It's not a citizens' council. And so that means it's not a representative body. But community foundations rely on voluntary engagement, meaning that they try to attract citizens and win them over and get them involved in the community foundation. Of course, we know from research that in civil society, there are groups that are naturally more inclined to get involved than others. And this is something that community foundations have to address. And I would say that they often try to reach out to local social groups via their outreach work. They try and bring in groups that may not have natural or direct access to the community foundation. So yes, they try and reach out to these groups that are not always included. And that was in response to the second question. Should I now say something in response to the first question? On trust, I believe it was. Well, we've got Inga back with us now. And I think she's written a response in the chat. But Inga, perhaps you'd like to say something about that out loud. Yes, sorry, I lost connection. Well, I think that the underlying question is, how can entities get in touch with philanthropy? How can they reach out to philanthropy? And that's a really vast subject. But just to be sure that I've properly understood the question, the question is about creating a relationship of trust once the contact has been established, but what about the initial contact? So once again, I'm speaking from the standpoint of an ideal relationship, and I know that a lot of foundations are not necessarily lucky enough to have an ideal relationship because they don't have the funds, they don't have the time, etc. So getting in touch is an issue, and I would really invite all of you, if you have a contact, to get in touch with that person, to go to conferences, reach out to people representing foundations. It's not easy, of course, but that initial contact needs to be made, and then it can lead to a partnership. But often I unfortunately have to answer, I'm sorry, I just can't meet you because we're at our max. But if I can see that I have the possibility to help in some way, I might not necessarily develop a relationship based on partnership myself, but I can put people in touch with colleagues. I can take the time to do that online or in person. So I think the real question is that philanthropy is not currently accessible enough. It's incomprehensible, and each foundation is different and has its own way of working. And so there's some advice that we can give, but establishing the initial contact and then developing a relationship based on trust, ideally. Well, there are 36 million responses because there are 36 million foundations and each one operates in its own way. So I'm sorry, I can't really say any more on that. We'd need to organise a whole other webinar just on that subject. Well, yes, we could host the webinar next on how to reach out to foundations. Yes, we could. Well, we're getting to the end, and I would now like to give you a minute just to say some closing remarks, just for some last words. Rupert, would you like to start? I've got 1 minute to save the world, have I? That's a difficult task. What I can say is that for foundations, for private donors, for everyone involved in philanthropy, we are going through a very difficult time because of the context we're working in. On the other hand, there are huge opportunities, and we can put certain things back in the hands of citizens that might have perhaps unjustly shifted to the state in recent years. And we should definitely take advantage of this opportunity. We need private initiative to preserve our European society. And now's the time to make this initiative very clear and to implement it. And not just leave everything up to the state. And last but not least, a very heartfelt thanks to the French Institute for Civil Society Organisations for organising this webinar. It's been a great opportunity. Thank you. Thank you very much, Rupert. Now, Inga, do you have any closing remarks? Well, I've already said a lot, but I'd like to end by mentioning dialogue. As long as there can be dialogue between people and actors that might not operate in the same way or have the same ideas, and these people can take the time to understand each other and express themselves and create these spaces, as Kathrin, you rightly said, so these spaces for dialogue and meeting each other, then things can be done. We also need action, spaces for action, not just thinking. It's important to think, of course, but it's also important to act. But acting based on dialogue, listening, inclusion, participation, and that's the note I'd like to end on. And I'd also like to thank you very much for inviting us here today. Thank you, Inga. Now, Kathrin, any final words? I'd also like to say thank you very much for organising this meeting today. And as a final word, I'd like to say that I know we're going through an extremely challenging time at the moment, with many crises, and this leaves people with a feeling of helplessness. And I believe that we need to bring back the concepts of agency and self-efficacy. We need to bring these back to the fore and show people that change can happen on a small scale in the places we live, and that there are concrete opportunities for participation. And that's where I see a crucial role for community foundations. I also believe that we need a lot of networking at European level, and at TechFi, that's what we're doing. Unfortunately, we're now seeing globally and in the transatlantic relationship that things have become quite turbulent, and that makes European solidarity even more important. The issue of democracy concerns us all in Europe, and in some countries the situation has shifted quite considerably, such as in Hungary. In Germany, however, things are changing too, and so I think it's very important to support each other, to learn from what others have already done and tried in other contexts. Thank you very much. Thank you, Kathrin. So to conclude, I won't go back through everything that you've said, but I'd like to pick out a few things that seem to have emerged from our discussions. So the first thing is relationships, not in the sense of a contract or a mechanism, but as a structure in its own right with its balance, its asymmetries. And what our discussions have suggested is that in this structure, intentions, trust, partnerships, contributions all count, but they're still fragile. And secondly, democracy, not just as a slogan, but as a daily practice, via governance, participation, counterpower, the ability to create links, to raise awareness, because philanthropy is very much at the heart of the issues it deals with. It's very exposed and it has its own share of responsibility. And thirdly, the local aspect is a place for experimentation, but it can also be quite fragile. It's a space where cooperation is built over the long term, where local issues change the nature of relationships and where trust becomes a type of collective capital. And then finally, it's all about choices, strategic choices, political choices in the noble sense of the term, the choice to take risks and to break out of our comfort zone and to move towards dynamics that are still uncertain and innovating, of course, not mechanically, but as a real strategic choice. And then one main thread that's run through our conversation is the capacity of the civil society and philanthropic sectors to make contributions, not necessarily in terms of just funding, but in terms of the relationships that are built. And so building a type of philanthropy that really contributes is to accept this and to align values and practices, to take action in a tense democratic context, and also think about the local aspects and the asymmetries that may emerge. And that's why this Franco-German dialogue is so important, and also the Urano project that the French Institute for Civil Society organisations wants to launch at European scale in 2026, not just to provide stock responses, but to open up these spaces for reflection and cooperation and for transformation. So to conclude, I'd like to warmly thank our partners, the Franco-German Citizens Fund, the JEPFA as well for its support. I'd like to thank our three speakers, Kathrin, Inga and Rupert, our partner Maecenata, also the team of the Institute, Amira, Fabrice and Yannick, and our interpreters too. And thank you very much to all of you for being with us today, for your questions throughout this webinar. And please feel free to keep up to date with the work done by the Institute. And if I could ask for a couple more minutes of your time, we have a satisfaction survey in French and in German, and you can find a link to that in the chat. So if you wouldn't mind taking a few moments just to fill that in before we close this webinar. Thank you very much to everyone, and I hope to see you again soon.